And our second foreign lecture comes from University of Nevada, Professor Monica Miller. I want to thank you, Professor Miller, because not only did you agree to join us today, but you also adjusted to our time zone. Just to everybody knows, there is a 9-hour difference between Nevada and Croatia. So, a few words about our respected lecturer. Monica Miller is a foundation professor at the Department of Criminal Justice and the Interdisciplinary Social Psychology PhD program at the University of Nevada. She has a doctoral degree in social psychology as well as in law. Furthermore, she authored more books and research articles that we can count, and has been awarded for her work in research as well as in teaching and mentoring. One of her other amazing achievements is a book, The Social Science of the COVID-19 Pandemic, a call to action for researchers, about to be published by Oxford University Press. The book, which was edited and co-authored by Professor Miller, also includes a chapter on the experiences of experts in Zagreb in supporting mental health of children and youth after the earthquake, written by a group of authors. Today, she decided to share with us the social science perspective on the pandemic, and we are truly honored and grateful to be able to welcome her. Professor Miller, the stage is yours.
All right, thank you. Thank you all for coming. I will try to share my screen here. Can you see my screen?
Yes, perfectly.
Oh, good. Okay, good. I'm never really sure how this is going to work, so thank you. So yes, thank you for that warm welcome. That's very nice of you to introduce me. So, and it's such an honor to be here. I'm here to talk about the social science of the COVID pandemic. So this topic is a little more theoretical, and how a lot of people in academia are thinking about the pandemic. And like you said, this is going to be a book, and I had some help from these students, Anna Fine, James Ragsdale, and Catherine High, who helped me put this presentation together. All right, so this is the name of the book. It's, like you said, it's an edited book. It will be published by Oxford University Press here later this year, and it will contain approximately 45 chapters. Some of them talk about the law, policy, and the ethics of the pandemic. Some of them talk about the behavior that we do that affects the severity of the pandemic and how long it lasts. Some of the theories talk about the outcomes of the pandemic. And then the final section is about the research about the pandemic and research during the pandemic. And so our goal was to think theoretically about the pandemic, to also give everyone a call to action so that they future researchers can investigate here. Okay, so I want to talk today about some of the chapters most relevant to well-being in the pandemic. And on each slide, I have the citations for the chapter in the book. The first thing I'll talk about is self-enhancement bias. And this is a bias in which people sometimes believe that they are better than others on some measure. So this applies to the pandemic. If somebody believes that maybe they are more cautious than others, or maybe they have a false sense of security that they are somehow immune. And what happens is people will think, well, I'm more careful than everybody else, so I'm not going to get it, right? Or my immune system is stronger than everybody else's. And self-enhancement can play a role in counterproductive behavior during the pandemic, because people get overconfident in whether they are going to be susceptible or not. Right? The second item on this slide is reactance theory. And this is a psychological theory that suggests that when people have their freedoms limited, they develop a strong motivation to react negatively towards having their freedoms restricted. So COVID policies were very strict, especially at first. We couldn't leave our houses, we couldn't go to work, we couldn't have face-to-face interactions with our friends. And some people might have believed that their personal freedoms were being threatened, and this could have the consequences to make people react negatively and do just the opposite, right? Strike out against the government, and this could lead to a backlash and engagement in risky behaviors. So these are two of the examples of psychological factors that might affect our behavior that would put us at risk of COVID. Moral panic is a social psychological event that is characterized by concern over some event, in this case, a pandemic, and hostility towards those people who are perceived as being responsible arises because of this negative event. So, for instance, we might have seen in some circumstances that people from China were regarded as being at fault, and there were instances of people acting negatively, even violently, towards Chinese people because they were perceived as being at fault for this virus. And a moral panic is also characterized by a disproportionate public reaction and volatility in interest from the public. So we get really upset. Sometimes it is not even proportionate to the actual threat, that people basically get too emotional, right? Now here, this is a pretty big threat, right, to our own health, but some people would think that some people overreacted to, having to wear a mask, right? That they decided to boycott or have some kind of protest or something like that, right? Now, the moral outrage usually ensues from reactions from a minority of people who did not comply with the measures, but there's also been an inverted perception of moral outrage, such as conspiracy theories that are connected to COVID, like a conspiracy theory about 5G cellular towers, or or that the vaccines have a microchip in them that is allowing someone to be able to track us, right? So we have these perceptions that come out of a moral panic that might lead to such conspiracy theories. Now, one of the other theories that might affect our mental well-being is called terror management theory. And research on terror management theory has shown that a heightened death awareness motivates people to strive for psychological comfort by enacting two different kinds of psychological defenses. So when death is a focal attention, we have these proximal defenses that are activated that either encourage people to do very pragmatic things to avoid dying, or people become avoidant and they deny that this is happening, right? And this distracts themselves from thoughts of death, because that is very, very threatening. And that's why we call it terror management theory, that there are different ways to manage this fear. And so we have these ideas of protecting our worldview, which makes us feel more comfortable, maybe becoming more conservative, and also helping us prevent the thoughts of dying through promoting our self-worth and self-esteem. So we might have taken up a new hobby or something like that. And these are some ways to avoid thinking about death that could affect our mental well-being. Another factor related to mental well-being is trust. And there are some theories about trust, specifically in the medical profession, that are relevant here. And trust involves three key factors. The first one is ability. And this is the perception that the trustee has the competence and knowledge that means that they are deserving of our trust. The second is benevolence. This is a perception that the trustee is caring and concerned about me. And the third is integrity. This is a perception that the trustee's moral character, like how honest and trustworthy they are, how fair they are, makes them worthy of my trust. And the dissolution of trust in the medical profession occurs when these expectations are violated in ability, benevolence, and integrity. And we saw this in COVID because COVID created a world where the healthcare institutions shifted their focus from focusing on individual people to focusing on populations, and in a situation where everyone is vulnerable, where changing science contributed to questioning doctors' abilities, because what we perceived as, you keep giving us inconsistent advice, wear the mask, don't wear the mask, oh, wear the mask, now don't wear the mask. That's in part due to studies and changing situations, but it might negatively affect our trust in the legal system. We also saw a lot of well-being related to relationships be negatively impacted by the COVID pandemic, right? So couples that were married or cohabiting had a number of challenges. For instance, financial losses, employment disruptions, maybe they had lack of daycare if they had children, or the schools closed. And of course, if they were working from home, they lost their personal space. So now maybe both of the people were working at home and they're together 24 hours a day, where they used to have time apart and had time to themselves. And that negatively affected a lot of relationships. But that severity of that impact is, of course, also related to their pre-existing life conditions. For instance, if they were both employed and their financial situation and the health of their relationship to begin with, coupled with the severity of the inconveniences that they experienced because of the pandemic. And so over time, this could be very negative on relationships because of these drastic changes in their daily life. And this could have very chronic long-term distress for some people, and some people really began to show signs of resilience, that they were able to use the pandemic to build their relationship and really come together rather than being separate. There's also, effects on the family itself. And there's a chapter about the burdens of the pandemic on families, and especially on mothers, because mothers in a lot of country are disproportionately responsible for childcare, and they suddenly became caregivers for their children 24 hours a day if daycares were closed, and they might have been responsible for schooling their children if the schools closed, and they had to make difficult choices about their own careers. And so we saw a lot of mothers dropping out of the workforce in order to care for their children because they saw that that was their duty to their family. And This chapter uses a family systems approach, which explores the processes by which parents and children operate and are interconnected with the family unit. And so the authors explored how mothers and children experience pandemic-related stressors within a family system, and how they actively work together as a unit to adapt and function within the pandemic life. And so this chapter really talks about the family unit and how it was affected by the pandemic. So next I'll talk a little bit about individual and group resilience during the pandemic. So there are various chapters that talk about resilience. And one of the chapters talks about emotional labor, and that is the introduction or induction or suppression of private feelings, which are replaced with more socially acceptable emotions. So that is monitoring yourself so that you don't, when you want to cry, you make yourself not cry, right? It is monitoring your own emotions because of the social situation. And this chapter is very interesting because it talks about this HEROES project that was launched at the start of the pandemic. And it was designed to track the well-being of frontline and key workers in the United Kingdom and Ireland in the aftermath of COVID. And it was a project with quantitative elements that measured resilience, burnout, and well-being through surveys, and also qualitative components through interviews. And so these authors studied emotional labor, and they recognized that this was important because anybody who was delivering services was also experiencing the pandemic themselves. So they studied the emotional labor components of this. And it developed a peer support network, and this peer support network included checking in with other people and through pre-planned meetings and after the interviews, and just reflecting on how they were doing personally, reflecting on what they had just experienced, and sharing it with other peers. And this is designed to reduce the negative impact of the pandemic. And they also had a lot of peer support, which helped everyone recognize the effect of that kind of work on their own well-being, which could really be important in order to keep them doing this work for longer. And this, you already mentioned, this project, there's a chapter in there that does address some individual resilience. And I won't talk about this a lot. I'm sure there's another presentation there, but this chapter outlines the initiatives that arose from the experts during the pandemic and during the earthquakes that had previously affected the city as well. And so this is an ongoing combination of having two major negative events at one time. And this group came together to give these efforts to protect and help the children. And the idea is that the city took the view that the psychological resilience of the children and adults stems from personal strength, as well as the support and resources offered by their environment. And the safety and support that the children have in their everyday life is the key to their recovery. In order to provide that, we need extensive collaboration between healthcare, education, social welfare experts, parents and families, institutions, and other members of the community that need to come together to develop these services to protect children and promote resilience in the city. So that's a really good example, and there's a whole chapter on how they went about that. Now, there are also 2 chapters on collective trauma and collective resilience. And this is collective in terms of the whole group as a one unit rather than individual people. So collective traumas are large-scale negative life events that impact the population broadly. And the pandemic is a collective trauma because everyone is experiencing it, this catastrophic event that shattered our assumptions about safety and security. And we were not expecting this, right? It happened without warning. And it was definitely a crisis that we experienced as collective trauma. So this first chapter talks about the theory behind collective trauma and how the COVID pandemic is, by definition, a collective trauma. But people came together and engaged in remarkable acts of solidarity, as in previous times of wars or other collective traumas. People cooperated together for the common good and often put aside their selfish behavior. And this is counter to a lot of the theories like the moral panic I talked about earlier. And during times of collective trauma, sometimes we see things that disprove the prediction of irrationality or moral panic or that mass panic I talked about earlier. So at times we can put away our selfish desires and we can all work together. And we have seen examples of that. Now, the social identity tradition originates from the work of Tajfel and Turner, and who proposed that as well as having personal identities, we can also have an identity as being part of a group, right? When we're a member of a group, we can take on that identity, and that can really help us get resilience and strength from other people. And the meaning that we get from membership in that group can really be central to our health and well-being. And this theory argues that disasters can create a sense of shared fate, right? We're all in it together. And this enables a shared social identity to emerge amongst all of these people. So we start to see each other less as individuals, but more as a member of the group. And this allows us to support other people. And this is the social identity model of collective psychosocial resilience that I list there on the slide. This was a neat chapter about nostalgia, which I had never really thought about, but the idea was that when we are threatened by this pandemic, we come together with other people and we share our past histories, right? So we have this surge of nostalgia, maybe we're bored, maybe we're lonely, but we decide to read books that we've read before, to watch movies that we haven't watched for years. And this nostalgia builds and maintains our self-positivity. So we seek out things that are very comforting to us. I watched a lot of episodes of the show Friends that came out in 1995 as part of my nostalgia. But the idea is that it can boost our self-esteem and provide a source of meaning in life and a sense of continuity between our past life and our current phase. There's also a chapter about leadership during the pandemic, and this leadership chapter talks a lot about transformational leaders. And these leaders have certain characteristics like timely and transparent communications. They admit their mistakes. And this analysis looked at various countries that did better or worse during the pandemic up to the point that they wrote the chapter. And they found that a lot of the countries that valued feminine traits or had a female leader often fared better at the time of that writing. So if we think about Germany or New Zealand, some of those countries were doing fairly well at that time. And one of the things that relates to the other chapter on trust is that inconsistent messages from the leaders can erode that trust and cooperation. I'm going to skip that one. Okay, so a lot of lessons learned from the pandemic are highlighted in the book, and some of them involve ways to study the pandemic. And one is about studying community sentiment, right? We will have a chapter in there by Murphy and Beaupre, and they talk about the study of community sentiment, or public opinion, if you will. And they discuss some of the methodological considerations, for instance, how to gain access to communities. For instance, they wanted to talk to people who have family members who are incarcerated in prisons. How do you find those people to be able to survey them and see if they are worried about their family members who are incarcerated in prisons or in nursing homes or some other place that makes them extra vulnerable. And so this chapter talks about various ways to study pandemic-related topics through social media, through Twitter, and through various op-eds. So some of this is what we would call secondary data, that people don't post things on social media in order to be studied, but you can study that. And then there are also a chapter about the theoretical and statistical ways to study the pandemic. And this chapter discusses how this is such a multidimensional and complex event. And they use the general process model of threat and defense. And it has lots of different measures, including things like lack of control, perceptions of uncertainty, and mortality salience, which relates to that terror management theory that I mentioned earlier. And they discuss how you can put all of many factors together, measurements, and use structural equation modeling to study this very complicated phenomenon. So rather than having 15 studies that look at 15 different measurements that predict your well-being during the pandemic, you could do one giant study and use this structural equation modeling to study all those 15 factors in one design rather than in 15 different studies. And there's a chapter about the importance of studying both the positive and negative of the human experience. And this chapter was nice because it reminded us that the COVID pandemic isn't all gloom and doom. And it's important to also study, acts of heroism and post-traumatic growth, how some people have used the pandemic as a way to grow personally and to learn from this trauma, in addition to when you're studying stress and anxiety and the negative kind of dark side of that. And then there's a chapter about the ways to deliver services in the community related to COVID. And there's a chapter about the ethics of social science research and the ethics of providing services and some of the challenges that come with this. For instance, informed voluntary participation. Well, if you're studying in the community, you're providing these services, but they're not the people who are receiving the services aren't necessarily consenting to participating in your study, but they want to receive the services. So there might be some ethical dilemmas there, that the people want to receive services, but they don't necessarily want to be studied, but they will consent sort of to being studied just to receive those services. And if we're studying something like prisoners, they might feel that they have no chance or no choice other than to be studied. And there's a chapter in the book that talks about how to educate people so that they're not so susceptible to fake news or misinformation. And they called it the inoculation effect, right? And they developed a game which helps build our cognitive processes to reduce susceptibility to misinformation so that we can better sort out the fake news from the real news, and we can better sort out what is reliable information rather than what is just somebody making up some misinformation. And there's also a chapter about how we can develop our moral cognitions better, and we can create public health messages to help people adopt better behaviors like wearing masks and social distancing, and how to make these messages most persuasive by using social cognitions that social psychologists will study. So that's what I had for today on the theories and how the people in my group have started to theoretically think about the pandemic, and hopefully will prompt other researchers to study these. I'm sure a lot of the authors are already doing that themselves, but our main goal was to discuss the theory, many theories that can be applied to the pandemic, and then encourage people to actually study those theories. So thank you all for your attention, and thank you again for inviting me to present.
Thank you so much. We have a few questions, if you have a few minutes. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Miller, on your really interesting presentation. I was wondering, could you tell us a bit more about the problem of lack of trust towards medical personnel during the pandemic you mentioned?
Yeah. So that chapter is, let's see, is written by a social psychologist and a medical doctor who happen to be married to each other. And yeah, they talk about the theories of trust, which include the one that I talked about with ability, benevolence, and integrity. And they talk about how COVID has violated these perceptions that build trust, how COVID has created a world where healthcare has refocused their attention, right? So instead of focusing on me as an individual, now healthcare has to focus on the whole world, right? And that sometimes is not comfortable to us. We don't want to be told, wait in your car before you can go to the doctor, or you can't go to the grocery store, or you can't just go to the parks or what have you, because of this mental, or because of this physical threat, and that has some mental health issues for everyone feeling isolated. And so this shift in focus of healthcare to the more world level rather than individual level has really left everyone feeling vulnerable, like the healthcare system doesn't care about them as a person anymore. And of course, when science changes and recommendations change, that, oh, you have to have a vaccine. Well, now you have to have 2 doses of vaccine. Well, now you have to have a booster. And sometimes that feels like the messages are changing really quickly, right? And so these things affect those aspects of trust, like the ability, benevolence, and integrity of the system. But the authors do provide a lot of ideas about how to study trust in their chapter. So we're hoping that if we can get a lot of research done on trust during the pandemic, that research could also be used during future crises.
Thank you very much for your answer, Professor.
I have one more question.
Okay.
You mentioned a very interesting term in your lecture, emotional labor. Can you please tell us a little more about it?
Sure. Yeah, that is the idea that when you're doing research on something that is affecting you personally as a researcher, it becomes very difficult to conduct that research because you are almost a participant in the same research, right? So if you are studying people being affected by the pandemic, they might talk about the difficulties in childcare and the difficulties educating your children because the schools are closed, or financial difficulties or relationship difficulties. And if you as a researcher are experiencing those same things, that might be a very emotional experience for you. And even if it's not, hearing these stories about people losing their loved ones or being scared about losing their loved ones or being unable to go visit their family members who are in assisted living or incarcerated in prisons or something like that, or you can't travel to see your family, those things are very sad. And just hearing those stories over and over and over again can create a lot of emotion in the researcher. And researchers who study death and dying particularly have these kinds of experiences that after hearing these sad stories day in and day out is very emotional. And yet they can't share that. They can't be the therapist, right? When you are interviewing someone and that person is crying and telling you the story about losing their loved ones, you're not a therapist, you're a researcher, and you can't provide services for them. You can't hug them, and so you can't even cry with them, right? And so the idea of emotional labor is that you have to keep all of your own emotion inside, that you have to remain an independent researcher, that you're not their friend or you're not someone providing mental health counseling or even a friendly ear to them. And so that buildup of emotion inside of you that you cannot release is very dangerous to the researcher. And so the authors talk about the system that they came up with, that different researchers can come together and have a peer network and be able to release some of these emotions so that the researchers themselves don't have extra trauma by hearing about other people's traumas.
Thank you very much for explanation.
Yeah, thank you.
Wow, this was so inspirational, all of these insights. And I have to ask, what is the date of the release of your book?
Well, I have one more chapter to write, and that's the conclusion. And then it will go to the publisher in the next couple months, and it will be out in the fall.
Thank you so much. I will make sure that everyone here knows and has information about the book.
Yeah, thank you. And I believe it will be both in paper copy and will be downloadable, either the whole book online, or you can just access individual chapters if you don't need the whole book. That's
perfect.
Yeah, thank you
so much for finding time.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. It was an honor to be here.
Hopefully we'll meet again live.
Yes, live, that would be nice. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.